I've got to update that some. Can you all hear me? Is this thing, there's a lady up there taping us tonight. Is that all right, Kurt?
Is that loud enough?
Okay, good. Actually, as a trial lawyer, my voice projects. Thank you for coming tonight. I enjoy telling this story and meeting people and talking about it. I've got some friends and old acquaintances here tonight that I appreciate coming. As Kirby said in my introduction, I've been involved in and looking at Lewis and Clark since the age of 11 when I joined Boy Scouts. This is my Boy Scout troop in 1961 or 2, I think 2 maybe. And I'm in the picture with that. And Rob Quist, who many of you know or have heard, is the kid with the guitar. In 1961, my Boy Scout troop went out to look. We needed a historic trail award from the Boy Scouts because then you get a really cool leather patch to sew on your backpack. And that was the impetus for Bob Anderson, my scoutmaster, and Rob Quist's uncle to take us out on the Lewis and Clark Trail. We started with the journals and with a lady named Helen West at what was then the Museum of the Plains Indians, at that time staffed very heavily with anthropologists and archaeologists and a going concern. And Helen West said a really interesting site to go look for would be the fight where Meriwether Lewis fought with the Blackfeet and killed 2 of them in 1806 on his return trip from the West Coast. And so we got out the journals. Bob Anderson had been a pilot since World War II with his 2 brothers, and he had an old Cessna 185 tail dragger. He would take 3 of us at a time up, and we'd fly around, and we looked for the site described by Meriwether Lewis, both by his compass headings and miles in his journey up the Marias, and looked for the site where he encountered the Blackfeet. And to this day, I believe we found it. As with anything historic, there's always some discussion about the accurate location of sites and dates and things. And all indications in the journal are that Boy Scout Troop 44 from north of Cutbank found that site. And I was pleased to be a part of it. The following year, we floated the Missouri, and with, now I'm going to try and change slides. We floated the Missouri. There's what I really want in here. That's Wilbur Warner, former president of the Historical Society, former and one of the founders of the Lewis and Clark Trail Heritage Foundation. And the year after we found the fight, what we call the fight site or encounter site, Warner took us down the Missouri River, and we marked Lewis's campsites for the first time using a steel pipe, 2-inch steel pipe with a mile marker welded on it. And so a group of Boy Scouts, under the guidance of Wilbur Warner, went down the Missouri River from basically Coal Banks Landing through the White Cliffs to the Fred Robinson Bridge and marked all of Lewis's campsites. Subsequently, over the years with floods and so on, including the 64 flood, some of them disappeared. There are 3 still left, as near as I can tell by going out to check. And the BLM has since marked all those sites, during the bicentennial of the Lewis and Clark expedition during 2003 through 6. The BLM put benchmark type caps at each campsite. So if you're floating that stretch, there are excellent guides to that. Now I want to go back to another picture, and I'll just leave that up. And there's a map in here somewhere, right, Kelly? Hold on. So let's talk about Meriwether Lewis and his trip, having that background. In 1806, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark are on the Pacific. They're at Fort Clatsop near Astoria, Oregon, and they want to go home. It's time to get back to what they call the United States. So they start out and head back the way they came, and through basically the Spokane Falls area and up the Columbia and the Snake. And Lewis, the impatient soul that he always is, tries to get over the mountains too early. The Nez Perce Indians say there's too much snow. Just relax. Stay here till the end of what would be May, although that wasn't the Nez Perce term. And Lewis tried to get over the pass and had to turn back. So by June of 1806, Lewis and Clark find themselves at Missoula at a place that they've called Travelers Rest. It's where Lolo Creek goes up over the top, and it's just outside the town of Lolo, Montana, and is marked, and there's a big visitor center there if you get the chance. At Travelers Rest, they do something they haven't done before. They split up. They go a whole bunch of different ways. And in June and July of 1806, Clark is going back down to connect at the Three Forks with the Yellowstone, to go on to the Yellowstone and explore the Yellowstone. Lewis takes the shortcut through, he takes Highway 200, essentially, over Lewis and Clark Pass, back to Great Falls, where they buried on the way out these caches full of samples and specimens they've gathered. The men are anxious to get there because in one of the caches there are ropes of tobacco. And by now they've run out of Virginia tobacco. And those boys wanted to be back there. So they get back to Great Falls and by mid-July, and they've got a little downtime. They've cached 2 boats below the falls, and they have to move a bunch of stuff back to those boats. And Lewis has time to do one more thing, and that's explore the Marias drainage. So this being the Missouri River in dark red line, and you see a little loop up at the top with the lines. That's Lewis's route in late July 1806. Lewis takes 3 of his very best people. He rounds up horses, and like all horse stories, there's Lewis can't find his horses at the Sun River for a day or two. They hunt down the horses that have wandered off, and Lewis and Joseph and Reuben Fields, 2 young men from Kentucky, and a man named Drouillard, who is half Shawnee and half white. And Drouillard's been the man that Lewis, we eventually come to know him as sign talker. Drouillard speaks a lot of dialects as they go up the Missouri on the way out 2 years earlier, and he also understands Indian Sign Language, the universal system of communicating in the Indian nations. So Lewis needs Drouillard, who also is the best hunter, and these 2 Fields brothers, 3 young men who can live off the land very well, and Lewis, and they ride from where the Sun River comes into the Missouri, that's where they're camped, and they go straight north. And since you're a Montana crowd, you'll understand this geography because it's not quite showing up there. They ride straight north to Tiber Reservoir, basically, about where the dam is. They go up through Carter area and straight north till they hit the Marias River. Lewis and Clark saw the Marias River on the way out, and there was this big debate when they get to the confluence of the Marias and the Missouri about which is the Missouri, because Lewis's charge from Jefferson is go up the Missouri to its headwaters. And so the men all think the river to the right must be the Missouri. It's not, it's the Marias. And Lewis wants to go up and see where that river comes from, because from the French, we'd purchased all of the water strained by the Missouri, all the land strained by the Missouri. And Lewis wants to know, because that river's one of them, where does it come from? How far north did we purchase land? And he knows that he can ride straight north and intersect that river and then follow it and see where it goes. So Lewis and these 3 young men start out, they ride up to the Marias, and they follow the Marias, camping along the way. We've identified those campsites. And any golfers in the crowd, they camped about 400 yards from the Shelby Golf Course, that golf course on the Marias, right in that bottom. The next day they camp right below Cut Bank. And by now, they're on the north branch of Marias River, because just above, between Shelby and Cut Bank, at a place we call the Sullivan Bottoms or Sullivan Bridge, the Cut Bank and what we now call the Two Medicine come together and form the Marias. And Lewis, ever going north, takes the northern fork, and he camps near Cut Bank, Montana, and then the next day rides up into that loop And at a point west of Cut Bank, in an area that the locals call Seville, Lewis and those 3 men go the furthest north the expedition ever goes. There's a spot up there where the river, much to Lewis's dismay, turns, he says it turns to the south of west. If you follow the Cut Bank long enough, it goes up and then arcs to the south a bit, not much. But Lewis follows it a little further and follows it to a point where he can see the mountains, sort of. It's a rainy, rough time at the end of July 1806. He and his 3 friends are miserable. Their horses that they've been riding since Idaho are, Lewis says, indifferent, meaning they're shot. So Lewis, and he talks about shooting a bull buffalo, and this wounded bull buffalo outruns his indifferent horse. He can't, these horses are in rough shape. And Lewis sees the river turning to the south. He gets a little break, and he looks off to Glacier, that beautiful mountainscape, and sees an area where the mountains break, and he assumes, incorrectly, that the river comes out of what we now call Marias Pass, where the railroad goes through. There's a spot when you look at the mountains like a break, and Lewis decides that must be where this river's coming from. And I want no more part of it because that's to the south of him. So he camps there for about 3 days. His goal is to set the longitude of that camp. That's an important spot because it really is very near the northernmost part of our purchase. And he's using a device called a Harrison chronometer. The most expensive thing he owns on that trip is a clock. It's a watch, and it's used to calculate longitude. He needs to know when the meridian noon is there, and he needs a sunshot at that time of day, and he never gets it. It's raining, cold, it almost snows, and I have trouble when I give this talk to someone in Florida or California about snow in July, but Montanans get it. We used to have that, not so much anymore. Anyway, it's July 28th, 9th. They're hungry. He sends Drouillard, who he describes frequently as his best hunter, out. And Drouillard says, the Indians, there's lodges here, there's poles up all over. They come out here and hunt. There's no game in this quarter, is what Lewis says in his journal. And then he sends one of the Fields brothers out with her and says, go over to the other fork of this river, the other branch, the branch we now call the Two Medicine. Lewis is calling the main fork of the Marias River. And they go over there, they kill 1 buck deer, and then, you know, the homesteaders all lived on passenger pigeons in this country. And 6 of them have the misfortune of landing in Lewis's camp while his 2 hunters are out. And they dined sumptuously on passenger pigeon, now extinct, and deer when they bring back this buck. And Lewis talks about how miserable the weather is. I'm going to read to you quite a bit from the journals at the next camp, but I'm going to, because of time constraints, I'm going to summarize Camp Disappointment. Lewis had been to a place on the west coast that mariners had named Cape Disappointment. It's near Vancouver, Washington, on the Columbia. And when he gets up on the morning when he's going to get his sunshot, he says the clouds have lifted a bit and the mountains, the Rockies, are white to the base on July 27th, I think, 1806. And he says, I went to get my clock and found her to be dead. She had stopped. Second time in 2.5 years, the clock stopped. He said, it's as if the fates have conspired against me. And, which is a common phrase for Lewis, incidentally. And he winds it, starts it up, sets it, and it goes as usual. He never knew why it stopped. But he says, I am unable to get a longitudinal shot at this place. And the 2 men have been over to the Two Medicine, tell him there's trees over there, there's game over there, and it's a much better river to travel home on than the Cut Bank. So Lewis says, I take leave of this place, which I have now named Camp Disappointment. And they ride to the south, just a little bit east of the south, over, and if you're acquainted at all with the geography up there, and this loop doesn't quite do it, they basically ride by Mission Lake, someplace some of us have fished over the years, and they catch the Two Medicine above where the Badger comes in. Badger Creek comes in. And I want to read you a little bit about that because that's the start of Lewis's big days. And Lewis says, and I want to tell you one other thing. One of the things we admire most about Lewis when you study him is he's an excellent botanist and observer. And you'll see that in this next set of journals. But Lewis observes in the first bottom he hits on the Two Medicine that the Colombian cottonwood and the narrowleaf and the broadleaf, 3 kinds of cottonwoods grow in that bottom. And he says, this is the only place I've ever seen this. And it's also the only place modern botanists have ever seen it. He just is looking at the trees. He says there's choke cherries here and buffalo berries and rose hips. And he describes the flora. And he says, here's what he says when he leaves on a Saturday morning. The morning was cloudy and continued to rain as usual, though the clouds seemed somewhat thinner. I therefore postponed setting out until 9 a.m. in the hope that it would clear off. But finding the contrary result, I had the horses caught and we set out, bidding a lasting adieu to this place which I now call Camp Disappointment. I took my route through the open plain south of east 5 miles, passing a small creek at 2 miles. That's Willow Creek. And today when you drive US 2, there's a monument that the Great Northern Railroad put up during the Centennial. It's a Virginia sandstone monument, a target practice place for young hunters. Seems like it's got big holes in it. Also graffiti. But that monument marks the closest the railroad comes to Camp Disappointment. And it's very accurate. From the mountains where I changed my direction to south, 75 degrees east, for 7 miles. Further, I struck a principal branch of Marias River, 65 yards wide, very deep. He's describing the bottom. We've all seen the Two Medicine and Marias, or most of us. It's not 65 yards wide, but the bottom is. I passed this stream. That's Lewis talk for I crossed it. I passed this stream to its south side and continued it 2 miles on this course when another branch, that's Badger Creek, of nearly the same dignity formed a junction with it, coming from the southwest. This last is shallow and rapid, has the appearance of overflowing its banks frequently and discharging vast amounts of water at certain seasons of the year. And just about any of the Blackfeet who live in the Badger and Swift drainage can tell you that's so. The beds of both these streams are pebbly, particularly the south branch. The water of the north branch is very turbid, while that of the south branch is nearly clear, notwithstanding the recent rains. I passed the south branch. So he crosses Badger, which runs a little to the north of east, just above its junction, and halted to dine and graze our horses. They're eating what little meat they've brought with them. Here I found some Indian lodges, which appeared to have been inhabited last winter in a large and fertile bottom, well stocked with cottonwood timber. The rose, honeysuckle, and redberry bush constitute the undergrowth, there being but little willow in this quarter. Both these rivers, I keep walking into that line, both these rivers above their junction appear to be well stocked with timber, or compared with the other parts of the country. Here it is we find the 3 species of cottonwood which I have remarked in my voyage assembled together. That species common to the Columbia I have never before seen on the waters of the Missouri, also the narrow and the broadleaf species. During our stay at this place, Reuben Fields killed a buck, a part of the flesh of which we took with us. And then now he's observing the critters. And this is another time when Lewis really shines. We saw a few antelope, some wolves, and a smaller species of fox of a reddish-brown color with the extremity of the tail black. He's describing the kit fox, which the Blackfeet and the Crow and the Fort Peck people have tried to reintroduce with some success. It is about the size of a common domestic cat, burrows in the plain, After dinner, I continued my route down the river to the north of east, about 3 miles, when the hills, putting in close, the bluffs come in at that point on the Two Medicine, coming in close on the south side, I determined to ascend them to the high plains, which I did accordingly, keeping the fields with me. Drewer crossed the river and kept down the valley of the river. I had intended to descend this river with its course to its junction with the fork I'd ascended. In other words, he's headed to where the Cut Bank and the Two Med come together. And from thence to have taken across the country to Rose River. Lewis names what we now call the Teton River the Rose River because of all the rose petals and stuff on it. And to send that stream to its confluence with the Marias River. The country through which this portion of Marias River passes to the fork, which I ascended, appears much more broken than that above and between this and the mountains. Now, this is where Lewis runs into the Blackfeet. And some of you have been out there with me, but not many of you, and I hope all of you get a chance to go there with me. I'll extend an invitation shortly. But the cliffs come in, and it's impossible to ride a horse down the valley. What Lewis has done is go up onto the plains above and get back of the niches that he's talking about to ride downstream. He sends Drewer to hunt in the bottom. And Lewis says then, I'd scarcely ascended the hills before I discovered to my left at a distance of a mile an assemblage of about 30 horses. I halted and used my spyglass, by the help of which I discovered several Indians on the top of an eminence just above them, who appeared to be looking down toward the river, I presumed at Drewyard. Now Lewis, on his way out, spent time with the Mandans and Hidatsa and Arikara in the Mandan villages near present-day Bismarck. And he'd been told by every Indian downstream from there, stay out of Blackfeet country. We all just agree, we stay out of the buffalo country of the Blackfeet. The Nez Perce had a tradition of coming through Lewis and Clark Pass on Highway 200 to hunt buffalo, but they would get a buffalo or two and get back. They didn't ever venture very far into Blackfeet country. The Blackfeet ruled. They had the horse by now for a time. They had the best weapons available to Native Americans by virtue of their trading with Hudson Bay, and they didn't like people coming into their country. And their country extended very far south, clear to the Yellowstone and beyond. The Crow were down in a corner, and the Nez Perce and Flatheads, Kootenai and Salish were to the west. But everybody agreed it's best to stay out of Blackfeet country. And Lewis knew that. But he'd come up into this country because he wanted to see where that river came from. And our late friend Stephen Ambrose, if you've read Undaunted Courage, and I suspect most of you have, is very critical of Lewis for taking this little juncture. And especially critical that Lewis appears in his journals to have taken all his journals with him on that sojourn. So a lot was at stake. But here's Lewis, and he says, they appeared to be looking downward at the river, I presumed at Drewyard. About half the horses were saddled. This was a very unpleasant sight. However, I resolved to make the best of our situation and to approach them in a friendly manner. I directed Joseph Fields to display the flag which I brought for this purpose and advanced slowly toward them. The butte today on the USGS topographic maps, courtesy of Wilbur Warner, the guy, and you can name things or put in, it's Flag Butte on the USGS maps. If you type that in, it comes up where he runs into these young kids. Now, you'll find out there's more horses than Indians here. My friend Jack Gladstone likes to say that the young men Lewis is about to encounter had done a great service to those horses by going to Crow country where it's dry and windy and liberating those horses and allowing them to come to the lush pastures of the Blackfeet. So they're just out doing social work. About this time, these young men discovered us and appeared to run about in a very confused manner, as if much alarmed, their attention having previously been so fixed on Drewer that they did not discover us until we began an advance upon them. Some of them descended the hill on which they were and drove their horses within shot of its summit. and again returned to the height as if to wait our arrival or to defend themselves. I calculated their number being nearly or quite equal to that of their horses, that our running would invite pursuit, as it would convince them that we were their enemies, and our horses, remember I told you about the horses, and our horses were so indifferent that we could not hope to make our escape by flight. Added to this, Drewer was separated from us, and I feared that his not being apprised of the Indians, in the event of our attempting to escape, he would most probably fall a sacrifice. Under these considerations, I still advanced toward them. Lewis, in the past 2 years prior to this, has become very fond of Drewer. He relies on him. At one point, Drewer goes off and is gone about 3-4 days hunting and looking for the lost horses, and Lewis writes almost like a eulogy to Drewer about what a fine young man he is and how much he loves and depends on him. So, with that in mind, Lewis decides to go meet with these young men. When we had arrived at a distance of within 1/4 of a mile of them, one of them mounted his horse and rode full speed toward us, which, when I discovered, I halted and alighted from my horse. He came within 100 paces, halted, looked at us, and turned his horse about and returned as briskly to his party as he advanced. That young man had just counted coup on Lewis. He'd ridden to an enemy, got close without doing anything, and come back alive and without causing a deal. In horse culture, Native American culture, he had counted coup on Lewis. Also, he determined whether they were going to shoot or not. While he halted near us, I held out my hand and beckoned him to approach, but he paid no attention to my overtures. On his return to his party, they all descended the hill and mounted their horses, advanced toward us. Leaving their horses behind them, we also advanced to meet them. So here come these young men, and here comes Lewis, and out on the Montana prairie, they're riding toward one another. I counted 8 of them, but still suppose there were others concealed, as there were several other horses saddled. I told the 2 men with me that I apprehended that these were the Minataris from Fort Prairie, and from their known character, I expected that we would have some difficulty with them. That if they thought themselves sufficiently strong, I was convinced they would attempt to rob us, in which case, be their numbers what they would, I should resist to the last extremity. Now remember, all of this that I'm reading, Lewis writes later. He didn't write this that night. And Lewis had been told to make peace among the Indians, to promote trade, to explore from Jefferson. He wasn't told to go out and have shootouts with the Blackfeet. And this is what in current military parlance is pretty much a CYA memo to President Jefferson, written later. But if you listen to him, you also see the detail that this military man is catching in terms of what's going on, where they are, and his situation. And so he says, I preferring death to that of being deprived of my papers, instruments, and gun, and desired that they would form the same resolution and be alert and on their guard. When we arrived within 100 yards of each other, the Indians, except one, halted. I directed the 2 men with me to do the same and advanced singly to meet this Indian, with whom I shook hands and passed on to those in his rear, as he did also to the 2 men at my rear. We now assembled and alighted from our horses. The Indians soon asked to smoke with us. They're communicating with sign language, but by 2.5 years in the Indian country, Lewis and the men of the expedition are getting pretty good at sign language. But I told them that, and I like to say that this is the first recorded time of a white person lying to the Blackfeet. And I can tell you, having practiced law for 37 years almost in Glacier County, and having lived there all my life, it wasn't the last time. But Lewis says, the young men say, they soon asked to smoke with us. But I told them that the man whom they had seen pass down the river had my pipe, and we could not smoke until he joined us. He wants Drewer back in the flock. He wants to pull his men together. I requested that they had seen which way he went, that they would, one of them, go with one of my men in search of him. This they readily consented to, and the young men set out with Reuben Fields in search of Drewer. I now asked them by sign if they were the Minataris of the North, which they answered in the affirmative. He's basically asked them, are you part of the Pagan or Blackfoot Confederacy? And they say, yes, we are. There's 3 bands of that stretch clear up into Canada. And so now he knows who he's camping with. I asked if there were any chief among them. And my quip is, and Gladstone and I go round and round about this, but my quip is that the Indians are getting back at him for telling them a story. I asked if there was any chief among them, and they pointed out 3. I did not believe them. However, I thought it best to please them and gave to one a medal, to the second a flag, and to the third a handkerchief, which they appeared well pleased. They appeared much agitated with our first interview, from which they had scarcely yet recovered. In fact, I believe they were more alarmed at this accidental interview than we were. From no more of them appearing, I now concluded they were only 8 in number, and became much better satisfied with our situation, as I was convinced that we could manage that number should they attempt any hostile maneuvers. So there's Lewis and 3 friends. They're outnumbered 2 to 1, but this military man talking to his superior says, we can handle this. So, as it's growing late in the evening, I proposed we should remove to the nearest part of the river and encamp together. I told them, second lie of the day, I told them I was glad to see them and had a great deal to say to them. Now, those of you who studied a little Lewis and Clark know whenever Lewis ran into a different tribe, he had a great deal to say to them. He always held these big councils and lectured the Native Americans and told them what a great deal it was that the U.S. government was coming. And they would have these big powwow type things for days. So he says, I have a great deal to say to them. We mounted our horses and rode toward the river, which was but at a short distance on our way. We were joined by Drewer, Fields, and the Indian. If I stumble a little reading this, 2 reasons. 1, my eyes aren't that good. And 2, if you do computer research and do the spelling and you try and transpose Lewis, your computer with spell check goes nuts. It just doesn't like it. I had a little struggle with that today. We descended a very steep bluff about 250 feet high to the river, where there's a small bottom of nearly half a mile in length and 250 yards wide at its widest part. The river washed the bluffs both above and below us, and through its course in this part is very deep. That paragraph tells everyone who wants to go looking how to find the fight site. In those 6 lines, Lewis, bear with me, Lewis tells us where he's at. And he also describes the only place on the Two Medicine that looks like that to this day. The bluffs are so steep that there were but a few places where they could be ascended and are broken in several places by deep niches, which extend back from the river several hundred yards. And then he says, he repeats himself, their bluffs being so steep that it is impossible to ascend them. In this bottom, there stand 3 solitary trees, near one of which the Indians formed a large semicircle camp. They set up a teepee. Now I'm going to mess with this thing and see how it goes. What? Don't want that one? Want the, Kelly's in charge. Audio, visual. You can see the niches. You can see the bluffs. Lewis met these young men up on that far hill at Flag Butte. They come around. There is a way, if this is your backyard, like those young Blackfeet, there is a way down to the river. And they go right to it. And they camp under 3 trees. Cottonwood trees need to be watered every year. Floods. A good cottonwood population stands there because the rivers come up and bring nutrients to the cottonwood base and cause new ones. These 3 trees grow a good 75 yards from anywhere the river is, but there is a spring above them. There is a spring just above them that waters and provides nutrients. When we went there in '61, those trees they didn't look this bad, but they looked pretty rough. Cottonwoods also don't last forever. But we cored them, and they were cork. There really wasn't anything like a ring that you could date them with. So the Park Service was working with us then, and they went into the trees on the river, bored trees of equal girth, and they were right at 175 years old. So when we go down there, there's these old rugged cottonwoods that Lewis camped under. So he says, so I told you about the semicircular camp of dressed buffalo skins. And they invited us to partake of their shelter, which Drew and I myself accepted. The fields lay near the fire in front of the shelter. And remember, it's been raining. The ground's all muddy and wet, and it's not let up entirely. With the assistance of Drew, I had much conversation with these people in the course of the evening. And here's Lewis as ethnographer. Some of the best ethnography done of tribes that weren't there when the fur trade got there 10, 15, 20 years later, Lewis did. They identified tribes that by the time the next wave comes are gone. Disease from the West Coast and disease from, I was talking to the aforementioned Jack Gladstone about 3 o'clock, and he said, yeah, you brought us guns, germs, and steel. And that's basically true. But he says, this is Lewis as an ethnographer. I learned from them they're part of a large band which lay encamped at present near the foot of the Rocky Mountains on the main branch of Meriwether River. I'm supposed to watch the time. On our 1.5 days march from our present encampment, about where the Catholics in 1889 built what's called the Holy Family Mission. That there was a white man with their band. By now, Thompson of the Hudson Bay Company has trappers all over the country. Lewis and Clark aren't first, by any means. They've been in here for 10 years. And Lewis wants to know who that guy is. That there was a white man with their band. That there was another large band of their nation hunting buffalo near the Broken Mountains. That would be the Sweetgrass Hills. And were on their way there from there to the mouth of Meriwether River, where they would probably be in the course of a few days. They also informed me that from hence to the establishment where they trade is on the Saskatchewan River is only 6 days easy march, or such as they usually travel with their women and children, which may be estimated at about 150 miles. That from these traders they obtain arms, ammunition, spirituous liquor, blankets, etc., in exchange for wolf and beaver skin. Now here's Lewis telling these guys that I'm going to upset your apple cart. Your world is over. We're going to change things. And I think it has a lot to do with what transpires during the night. Lewis says, I told these people I had come a great way from the east up the large river which runs toward the rising sun, that I had been to a great waters where the sun sets and had seen many great nations, of whom I had invited to come and trade with me on the rivers on this side of the mountains. He's saying to these young Blackfeet, I've invited all your friends from over west, come over here and trade with us. And we're going to back them, and we're going to trade with them, and they're going to come to your territory. That I think in the Middle East there's some corollaries today. That I'd found many of them at war with their neighbors and had succeeded in restoring peace among them. That I was now on my way home and had left my party at the falls of the Missouri, with orders to descend that river to the entrance of Meriwether River, and there to wait my arrival, and that I had come in search of them, in order to prevail on them to be at peace with their neighbors, particularly those on the west side of the mountains, and to engage them to come and trade with me when the establishment is made at the entrance of this river. To all of which they readily gave their assent, and declared it to be their wish to be at peace with the Tushpas, which is another way of saying the Kootenai or the Salish, Tushpas, whom they said had killed a number of their relations lately. And they pointed to several of those present who had cut their hair as an evidence of the truth of which they asserted. Lewis knows by now that Native Americans grieve by cutting their braids or their hair, or even in real severe cases, a finger. When I would meet a Blackfeet person who always had braids, if you meet one and then the next time you see him or her, they're gone, they're grieving. They only cut those braids as a sign of mourning. So these young men are saying, yeah, we just fought with those guys lately. I found them extremely fond of smoking, plied them with the pipe until late at night. I told them that if they intended to do as I wished them to do, they would send some of their young men to their band with an invitation to their chiefs and warriors to bring the white man with them and come down and counsel with me at the entrance of Meriwether River. Here's an example of scholarship. During the bicentennial, Kirby and I were talking before, tons of Lewis and Clark scholarship, as you might imagine. And in digging through the Hudson Bay archives in this century, they found notes from Thompson, David Thompson of Thompson Falls fame, from that white man saying that party of Americans roaming around our country had a shootout with the Blackfeet. And one Blackfeet died, where Lewis, you'll see, thinks he killed two. I told them that the balance of them would accompany me to that place where I was anxious now to meet my men. I'd been absent a long time, that they would go with me. I'd give them 10 horses and some tobacco. To this proposition, they made no reply that evening. And then Lewis beds down. He says, I took the first watch tonight till 2 a.m., and then I woke up Joseph Fields, and I told him be on guard because I suspected that if any of these young men left the camp or started to move around, that they would be trying to steal our horses. The other thing Lewis doesn't mention, but he and his men have the Harper's Ferry 1803 rifle, the most advanced technology in long rifle of the day when he leaves St. Louis. They were the top of the line. And these young men don't have that kind of firearm. So, and Lewis says one of his most famous lines, he says, I fell into a profound sleep and did not awake until the noise of the men and Indians awakened me a little after light in the morning. So on July 27th, 1806, Lewis is asleep inside a teepee, or inside a semicircular teepee, and he's awakened this way. This morning at daylight, the Indians got up and crowded around the fire. Joseph Fields, who was on post, had carelessly laid his gun down behind him near where his brother was sleeping. One of the Indians, the fellow to whom I'd given the medal last evening, slipped behind him and took his gun and that of his brothers unperceived by him. At the same instant, two others advanced and seized the guns of Drewer and myself. So now that these young men have control of 4 sets of the firearms. Fields, seeing the guns of Drewer and myself. Joseph Fields, seeing this, turned about to look for his gun and saw the fellow just running off with it, and of his brothers. He called to his brother, who instantly jumped up and pursued the Indian with him, whom they overtook at a distance of 50 or 60 paces from the camp, seized their guns, wrested them from him, and Reuben Fields, as he seized his gun, stabbed the Indian through the heart with his knife. The fellow ran about 15 steps and fell dead. So the Fields brothers, for the first time in 2.5 years, a Native American dies at the hands of the expedition. And they've had some close calls, they've had some arguments, but this is the first one. Of this I did not know until afterwards. Having recovered their guns, they ran back instantly to the camp. Drewer, who was awake, saw the Indian take hold of his gun and instantly jumped up and seized her and wrested her from him. But the Indian still retained his pouch. His jumping up and crying, "Damn you, let go my gun," awakened me. I jumped up, asked what was the matter, which I quickly learned when I saw Drewer in a scuffle with the Indians for his gun. I reached to seize my gun, but found her gone. I then drew a pistol from my holster and, turning myself about, saw the Indian making off with my gun. I ran at him with my pistol and bid him lay down my gun, at the instant of which he was in the act of doing, when the Fieldses returned and drew up their guns to shoot him, which I forbid, as he did not appear about to make any resistance or commit any offensive act. He dropped the gun and walked slowly off. I picked her up instantly. Drewer, having about the same time recovered his gun and pouch, asked if he might not kill the young man, which I also forbid, as the Indian didn't appear to wish to kill us. As soon as they found us all in possession of our arms, they ran and endeavored to drive off all the horses. I now hollered to the men and told them to fire on them if they attempted to drive off our horses. Lewis is 12 miles north of Valier, 5 miles upstream, and 147 miles from the confluence that he needs to be at. And on foot, it would take him a long time in Blackfeet country. Losing these horses would have been incredibly bad. They accordingly pursued the main party who were driving the horses up the river. I pursued the man who had taken my gun, who with another was driving off a part of the horses, which were to the left of the camp. I pursued them so closely they could not take 12 of their own horses, continued to drive one of mine with some others. At a distance of 300 paces, they entered one of those steep niches, back in here, in the bluff, with the horses before them. Being nearly out of breath, I could pursue no further. I called to them as I had done several times before. I would shoot them if they did not give me back my horse, and raised my gun. Lewis is using my approach to French and German. If you talk loud enough, you know. These kids, they knew they were being shouted at. They had no idea what he was saying. One of them jumped behind a rock and spoke to the other, who turned around, stopped at a distance of about 30 steps from me, and I shot him through the belly with a 51 caliber long rifle, a big ball, about the size of a quarter, and it hits the kid. He fell to his knees and on his right elbow, from which position he partially raised himself up and fired at me, and turning himself about, crawled in behind a rock, which was a few feet from him. He overshot me. Another famous line from the journals: being bareheaded, I felt the wind of his bullet very distinctly. So this kid just about got him. Now, a friend of Mark Murphy's and mine is Gary Dale, who's the state pathologist for a short time longer. Very interested in this story, and he's been out there with me. He says Lewis didn't hit that young man's spine, or he wouldn't have been able to raise up and complete the act of shooting. That is, moving about meant that Lewis had shot him, but that the bullet had passed probably through him. Not having my shot pouch, I could not reload my piece, and that there were two of them behind good shelters from me, I did not think it prudent to rush on them with my pistol, which I discharged. I had not the means of reloading until I reached camp. I therefore returned leisurely toward camp. Remember, he wrote this a couple days later. On my way, I met Drewer, who, having heard the report of the guns, rushes out to help him. I desired him to hasten to camp with me. They gathered up the horses. They saddled Indian ponies. They burned some shields and some bows and arrows. The Indians, in their haste, had left two old basic blunderbuss type shotguns, and they take one. They leave the other on the ground. And Lewis reclaims the flag and the handkerchief, and then in a, I think, incredible bit of bravado that was reenacted in many wars later, he said, I left the medal around the neck of the man I'd given it to, that they might know who we were. And the medals, incidentally, we call peace medals to this day, but not a very peaceful use of it. Now, some of you ride horses, I'm pretty sure. And I'm going to read to you about Lewis's flight, and then we'll talk about this a little more. Having ascended the hill, we took our course through a beautiful level plain a little to the south of east. My design was to hasten to the entrance of Meriwether River as quick as possible in hope of meeting with the canoes. And he talks about the first thing they hit is what we now call Birch Creek. Lewis called it the Battle River in the journal. So if you see that, that's what Lewis is doing. He's worried about these young men getting to the main band upstream and to that group that he talked to him about coming from the Sweetgrass Hills. And then he talks about how far they ride. He says, no time was there to be lost, and we pushed our horses as hard as they could bear. At 8 miles, we passed a large branch 40 yards wide, which I call Battle River, or Birch Creek. At 3 p.m., they start at daylight in July, about 5 a.m., and he says, at 3 p.m., we arrived at Rose River, about 5 miles above where we'd passed it on our way out. Having traveled, by my estimate, compared with former distances and courses, by now about 65 miles. Here we halted an hour and a half, took some refreshment, suffered our horses to graze. The day proved warm. Late rain supplied the little reservoirs in the plains with water and put them in fine order for traveling. Our whole route so far was as level as a bowling green, with but little stone and prickly pear. Then he says, after dinner, they stopped for an hour and a half. We pursued the bottoms of the Rose River, and then we again ascended the hills on the southwest, took to the open plains. By dark, we'd traveled 17 miles further. So, 67 and 17, we're still riding. We now halted to rest ourselves and horses for about 2 hours. We killed a buffalo cow, took a small quantity of meat. After refreshing ourselves again, we set out by moonlight and traveled leisurely. If you're a Lewis and Clark fanatic, you know that it was a full moon that night. You go back and look at that date, and you know Lewis is riding by exactly the full moon. And he's talking about still being thunderheads about, but he says, the moon gave us light. We continued to pass immense herds of buffalo all night, as we had during the latter part of the day. We traveled until 2 o'clock in the morning, having come by my estimate after dark another 20 miles. Anybody sore yet? Lewis is. He says, we turned out our horses, laid ourselves down to rest in the plains, very much fatigued, as may be readily conceived. My Indian horse, this is another line I just love. Lewis can wax poetic. He says, my Indian horse carried me very well, in short, much better than my own would have done, and leaves me with but little reason to complain of the robbery. And then Lewis gets up in the morning, he wakes the men at daybreak, and again it's July in Montana, it's really early, and he's up on the northern tier. He leaves and goes further, and as they're riding along, and they're down now by Great Falls, kind of north of Great Falls, but riding toward where Loma is today, to the confluence. And they hear a shot. They hear one shot. And, that concerns them a little, but they wonder, and they cut to the river, to the Missouri. And after riding for about 8 more miles, they come on the party that Lewis left at the Great Falls. The journals are full of these huge coincidences and luck, lots of luck. But Lewis, the shot he heard was that party hunting along the bottoms for the night's meal. So he reunites with his troops. They load up and they turn out the horses and climb aboard these 2 pirogues that they've left there the season before on their way out. And they ride on those boats down the Missouri. And in the meantime, I sent Clark down the Yellowstone. Clark split the party around the 10th of July, and he sends people north of the Yellowstone to explore that country at about Pompey's Pillar. And those people lose their horses to the Crow, or short some horses for another reason. And the Crow get those horses. They end up building bull boats and floating down the Missouri, or down the Yellowstone. Clark was supposed to wait for Lewis at the Yellowstone. That was the plan. But Clark always is plagued by mosquitoes. He just hates them. And when they get to the Yellowstone with his group, the mosquitoes are awful, and Clark leaves a note on a stick for Lewis and says, I'm out of here. Lewis is mad because it's his intent to take a longitudinal reading at that very important junction in the west, the confluence of the Yellowstone and Missouri. He's behind Clark. He hasn't got the time to wait till noon. Off he goes. They finally catch up with Clark. They go to the Mandan villages, and that's where the Indian woman with them is reunited with some friends. And then Lewis, Clark, and his men, who are in a rip to get back to St. Louis, take off again. Shortly thereafter, down in South Dakota, south of present-day Bismarck, Lewis goes into the woods to hunt elk, dressed in buckskin, no international orange, and the fiddle player, who wears a patch over one eye, shoots him in the rear end. Creases his rear end with one of those great big rifles. And Lewis says, damn you, man, you shot me. And Cruzat disappears. He goes, I was nowhere around. I don't know who shot you. But Lewis spends the rest of the trip on his belly in the back of the boat looking down, all the way through, down the Missouri to the Mississippi. But here's my hero Lewis. He takes the opportunity, because he's looking down, to make one more plant identification that he missed on the way out, and records it and draws it in the journal. So that's Lewis's exploration of the Marias. There are those who think and believe to this day that Lewis's interaction with the Blackfeet set the tone. 4 years later, Drouillard, who never goes back, on the way out, Lewis and Clark meet fur trappers coming north. The fur trade is coming. And a couple of people asked to be released from their Army commissions to go north with them, one being Drouillard. And in 1810, Drouillard is killed by the Blackfeet down by the Three Forks, brutally murdered and drawn and quartered by the Blackfeet. Do they know who he was? I don't know. But certainly he met his death at the hands of the Blackfeet. The Fields brothers returned to Kentucky. Everybody gets land grants. And Lewis, as you know, in my opinion, and this is another one of those history things, takes his own life at the Natchez Trace a couple years later. Clark becomes the Indian agent for the entire West and is in charge of relocating lots of tribes to the beauty of southern Oklahoma, beauty and lushness of southern Oklahoma. And that's Lewis on the Marias. Questions? That's what I got so far. Did I finish in time?